The tanker was just 20 minutes from the blockade line when it made its move. There was no warning, no radio communication, and no request for permission. The vessel, identified as Rich Starry, altered its course, increased speed, and proceeded directly toward the United States Navy's enforcement corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, behaving as though the blockade simply did not exist. On the bridge of an American warship, the response was immediate. Every system activated in unison. What followed in those next few minutes sent a clear and unmistakable signal, not just to Washington or Beijing, but to capitals across the globe. This was not about the cargo on board, nor the destination of the vessel. It was about intent, authority, and the response of the most formidable naval force currently assembled in that region. China had, in effect, tested the blockade. The United States answered swiftly, decisively, and without hesitation. But the real significance of that moment lies elsewhere. The turning back of the tanker was not the defining outcome. What mattered was what it revealed. Beneath years of carefully managed diplomacy, trade arrangements, and restrained public messaging, a deeper reality surfaced. For the first time in decades, the disparity between China's projected capabilities and its operational limits was exposed, publicly and in real time, on one of the most strategically critical waterways in the world. And that exposure carries consequences far beyond a single vessel reversing course. To understand why, one must look at the broader structure that has been quietly built between Beijing and Tehran over the past 15 years. The American blockade did not merely halt Iranian oil exports, it severed a strategic partnership, one that both nations had invested heavily in and one that China, in particular, had come to rely upon. China is, after all, Iran's largest trading partner and its most significant oil customer. Yet this relationship extends well beyond commerce. Iran provided China with access, geographic, strategic, and logistical, through belt and road infrastructure projects. Chief among them was the port of Chabahar, offering Beijing a critical transit route that circumvented traditional U.S.-influenced maritime pathways. In return, China supplied Iran with what it needed to endure sustained international pressure. That included technology, infrastructure development, diplomatic backing in international forums, and crucially, a shadow network of oil tankers. These vessels facilitated the continued flow of Iranian crude to Chinese refineries, effectively undermining Western sanctions and sustaining the Iranian economy during prolonged periods of economic isolation. What emerged was a parallel system, a steady exchange of oil, capital, and strategic protection operating largely outside the structures dominated by Washington. Iran depended on Chinese demand for economic survival. China depended on Iranian supply to maintain affordable energy and preserve its geopolitical footing in the Middle East. That system, however, was dismantled with remarkable speed. On April 13, 2026, the United States Navy moved to shut it down, not gradually, but in the space of a single morning. Key nodes of Iran's oil export infrastructure were effectively sealed. Karg Island, responsible for the vast majority of Iranian crude exports, was locked down. Chabahar, China's alternative gateway, was rendered inoperable. Bandar Abbas, a vital maritime hub, was similarly restricted. Every route through which China had been acquiring discounted Iranian oil was cut off simultaneously. The consequences were immediate. The Belt and Road investments tied to Iran were, for all practical purposes, neutralized overnight. Billions in infrastructure spending were left stranded. Diplomatic cover, including that provided through forums such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, became largely irrelevant as the situation shifted from negotiation to enforcement. And enforcement, in this case, was being carried out not through dialogue, but through overwhelming military presence. 3 carrier strike groups, supported by more than a dozen warships, sustained air patrols, and submarine operations, a level of force projection China currently has no capacity to challenge in that theater. Meanwhile, an estimated 190 million barrels of Iranian oil remained stranded at sea, unable to reach market. The strategic corridor built over years had been severed in a matter of hours. Yet even this was not the moment that fully revealed the scale of China's predicament. That came when Beijing chose to test whether the blockade would hold. The tanker Rich Star approached the enforcement line and advanced. Within 20 minutes, it turned back. Shortly thereafter, 2 additional tankers, including one identified as Austria, repeated the same maneuver. 3 vessels, all linked to Chinese interests, withdrew without confrontation. No shots were fired, no standoff occurred. There was, quite simply, compliance. In the aftermath, China's defense minister, Admiral Dong Jun, delivered a statement intended to project strength. He asserted that Chinese vessels had transited the strait. He emphasized existing agreements with Iran. He warned against American interference in Chinese affairs. It was, on the surface, a firm and confident message, widely disseminated through state media and diplomatic channels. But the reality told a different story. Not a single tanker was escorted through the corridor. Not one vessel was defended in practice by the rhetoric that had been issued. The discrepancy between declaration and action was visible, not just to policymakers, but to every military and intelligence apparatus observing the situation. And it is within that gap between stated power and demonstrated capability that the most consequential risks of this crisis now reside. China's challenge is not limited to the loss of Iranian oil. In the immediate term, that disruption is manageable. Beijing maintains substantial strategic reserves, estimated at roughly 130 days. It has the capacity to source alternative supplies, albeit at higher cost, and absorb short-term economic strain. The more pressing issue is structural, and it centers on the Strait of Hormuz itself. China imports in excess of 10 million barrels of oil per day, the vast majority transported by sea. Approximately 40% of that supply passes through Hormuz, originating not only from Iran, but also from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. In total, close to half of China's seaborne oil imports depend on that single maritime corridor remaining open and accessible. As long as the United States maintains effective control over the strait, China's energy security is, in very real terms, subject to American decision-making. For Beijing, that is an untenable position. It runs counter to 2 decades of strategic messaging. The assertion that China is emerging as a global power capable of operating independently of systems historically dominated by the United States. It also challenges the foundations of its domestic stability. China's industrial base, its manufacturing engine, and indeed the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself all rest upon a consistent supply of affordable energy. The expectation of continuous economic growth is not merely an economic objective in China, it is a political necessity, and that is precisely why the turning back of the rich star carries such weight. It was not simply a logistical decision, it was a moment in which China's claim to peer competitor status was tested under real-world conditions and found wanting. The question then is straightforward. What does Beijing do next? This is where the situation becomes markedly more dangerous because China does have options. The difficulty is that each carries significant risk and none offers a clean solution. The first option is direct military confrontation. In theory, China could deploy naval assets to the Strait of Hormuz and attempt to break the blockade by force. Its overseas base in Djibouti provides a logistical foothold, and the People's Liberation Army Navy has undergone rapid expansion over the past decade. Its growing network of ports across the Indian Ocean and into the Persian Gulf offers at least a framework for sustained operations. However, the operational reality in Hormuz is fundamentally different from anything China has previously encountered. The United States has assembled an extraordinary concentration of military power. 3 carrier strike groups centered on the USS Abraham Lincoln, USS Gerald R. Ford, and USS George H.W. Bush are supported by more than a dozen warships. Advanced fighter aircraft, including F-35Cs and FA-18s, maintain constant air patrols. P-8 Poseidon aircraft monitor maritime activity while submarines operate below the surface. In total, over 50,000 American personnel are present in the theater. Under such conditions, any attempt by a Chinese warship to force passage would almost certainly result in direct confrontation between 2 nuclear-armed states. Historical precedent offers a sobering comparison. In 1962, Soviet vessels approached a United States blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment widely regarded as the closest the world has come to nuclear conflict. Analysts are invoking that comparison deliberately. The risks are not theoretical. China, facing elevated tensions over Taiwan and already contending with economic pressure from American tariffs, is in no position to escalate militarily in a theater where U.S. superiority is both clear and overwhelming. The second option lies in what Beijing has successfully deployed elsewhere, so-called gray zone tactics. These involve the use of Coast Guard vessels, civilian maritime assets, and fishing fleets to assert presence without crossing the threshold into open conflict. It is a strategy that has proven effective in the South China Sea, where China has gradually expanded its influence without triggering direct military engagement. In Hormuz, Beijing could attempt a similar approach, escorting commercial tankers with Coast Guard vessels in an effort to establish a quasi-civilian convoy. Yet the context here is entirely different. Such tactics may succeed against regional coast guards, but they are unlikely to succeed against 3 American carrier strike groups. Should the United States choose to stop such a convoy, China would be faced with a stark choice: escalate further or withdraw. Either outcome carries significant reputational risk. If the convoy is halted, the narrative of a rising multipolar order, one in which China operates as an equal to the United States, would be publicly undermined. A decade of strategic messaging could unravel in a single incident. The third option is diplomatic and economic pressure, an arena in which China has traditionally operated with considerable skill. Beijing holds a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council and can veto any resolution that seeks to legitimize the blockade. It can build international opposition, support Iran's legal position, and attempt to shift the diplomatic balance. Additionally, China could escalate economic measures, reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, applying pressure through supply chains, and leveraging its dominance in key industrial sectors. However, these measures do not address the immediate issue. They do not reopen the strait. Diplomacy operates on extended timelines, months, even years. Energy markets, by contrast, function on a far shorter horizon. Chinese refineries require supply within days and weeks, not diplomatic resolutions at some indefinite future point. Moreover, economic retaliation is a double-edged sword. Any escalation in the trade war would inevitably impose costs on China itself, at a moment when it is already contending with the consequences of disrupted energy imports. The fourth option, and the one Beijing appears to be pursuing, is patience. China is, for the moment, absorbing the shock while attempting to redistribute the pressure. It has suspended exports of refined fuels such as gasoline and diesel, placing strain on regional economies like Japan and South Korea that rely on Chinese supply. At the same time, it has resumed imports of American liquefied natural gas, reintroducing a degree of economic interdependence that may offer diplomatic leverage. Simultaneously, Beijing is positioning itself as a critical supplier to Southeast Asian nations seeking alternative energy sources, thereby expanding its regional influence even as its own situation becomes more constrained. In essence, China is not attempting to avoid pain. It is attempting to ensure that others experience equal or greater disruption. The calculation, at least for now, is that restraint carries less risk than escalation. The fifth and final option is structural: the development of alternative routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. China has for some time invested in precisely such infrastructure. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, for instance, offers a potential overland route from the Arabian Sea into western China via the port of Gwadar. In theory, this could reduce reliance on Hormuz. The current crisis has underscored the strategic logic of such investments. However, these alternatives remain limited in capacity. They are not at present capable of replacing the volume of oil that transits Hormuz on a daily basis. They represent a long-term solution to a problem that is unfolding in real time. Chinese refineries require supply now, and that is the central dilemma. Every available option carries significant cost. Military escalation risks catastrophic conflict. Gray zone tactics risk public failure. Diplomatic efforts are too slow. Economic retaliation is mutually damaging. Infrastructure solutions are years away from viability. Beijing, therefore, is calculating, but it is not acting decisively. And it is precisely this gap between rhetoric and action that stands as the most significant strategic revelation of the current crisis. On the American side, meanwhile, the scale of deployment in the Strait of Hormuz is without modern precedent, and it continues to expand. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is already operating at full combat readiness within the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford Group remains positioned in the Mediterranean within rapid response distance. A third formation, centered on the USS George H.W. Bush, is now moving toward the theater. Once that third carrier group arrives, the United States will have concentrated 3 fully operational carrier strike groups within a single theater, an extraordinary projection of military power by any standard. This amounts to more than 50,000 personnel, supported by some of the most advanced surface combatants ever constructed. Air superiority is maintained continuously. Submarine assets operate unseen beneath the surface. In practical terms, there is no comparable naval force anywhere in proximity to the Strait of Hormuz. Equally, there is no realistic configuration of Chinese or Iranian capabilities that could match this concentration of force in conventional terms. Yet even this level of dominance is not without constraint. Sustaining 3 carrier strike groups in a single operational zone over an extended period presents significant logistical challenges. Aircraft carriers require ongoing maintenance. Crews must be rotated. Ammunition, fuel, and supply chains must be constantly replenished. Perhaps more importantly, every asset deployed to Hormuz is one that cannot be deployed elsewhere. Strategic theaters such as the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and indeed parts of Europe are, for the time being, operating without the full presence of American naval capacity. Other global actors are watching this carefully. There is also the question of Allied support, or more accurately, the relative absence of it. While the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have expressed support for the operation, key Western allies have taken a more cautious stance. The United Kingdom has explicitly declined to participate in the blockade itself, focusing instead on mine clearance and ensuring safe navigation. Germany and Australia have opted not to take part. France, alongside the UK, is conducting a separate maritime mission, deliberately independent of American command. In effect, the United States is leading one of the most consequential naval operations of the 21st century largely on its own. And while the blockade is undeniably effective, it is not absolute. Shipping data indicates that several vessels linked to Iran have successfully transited the strait since enforcement began, including ships already under American sanctions. This suggests a degree of selectivity in enforcement, decisions being made not only on operational grounds, but also on political calculation. The case of the Rich Starry itself illustrates this point. While the vessel turned back on its initial approach, it later succeeded in passing through. The blockade, therefore, is both real and operationally significant, but it is not impermeable. And it is precisely within that margin between stated policy and practical enforcement that China continues to test the limits, probing incrementally and observing the response. Iran, meanwhile, has undergone a profound strategic shift. For decades, its military doctrine rested on a single, defining assumption, that the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz constituted an effective deterrent. The mere threat of closure was sufficient to dissuade adversaries. The act itself, if carried out, would grant Iran leverage over global energy markets and, by extension, the international economy. Hormuz was, in essence, Iran's strategic safeguard. That assumption no longer holds. Since the commencement of Operation Epic Fury, that leverage has been systematically dismantled. Iranian air defenses were rapidly degraded. Coalition aircraft conducted strikes deep within Iranian territory, including in and around Tehran, without sustaining losses. Hardened underground facilities, long considered secure, were penetrated by advanced munitions. Key naval installations were destroyed. Elements of the Revolutionary Guard's command structure were neutralized. Supply lines to regional proxy forces were disrupted. In response, Iran did attempt to deploy its principal deterrent. It moved to close the strait, triggering a surge in global oil prices and causing widespread disruption to shipping and energy markets. But the American response was both calculated and decisive. Rather than simply reopening the strait, the United States redefined control over it. Mines were cleared. A secure maritime corridor was established. International shipping was permitted to resume. With one critical exception, Iran itself. Its ports were effectively sealed, its oil exports halted. The strait remained open to the world, but closed to the country that had once used it as leverage. In strategic terms, Iran's primary instrument of deterrence has been inverted, turned from a weapon into a constraint. The options now available to Tehran are, in practical terms, extremely limited. Remining the strait would require small craft operating in waters under continuous surveillance, a high-risk endeavor with low probability of success. Attempting a naval breakout is not feasible, given the degradation of its maritime capabilities. Direct attacks on Gulf infrastructure would risk unifying regional powers firmly against Iran, exacerbating its isolation. Escalation through proxy forces, whether in Lebanon, Yemen, or elsewhere, remains possible, but would broaden the conflict in ways that could invite far more extensive military retaliation. Each potential course of action carries consequences that would further weaken Iran's position. Meanwhile, the economic pressure continues to build. Oil revenues, estimated at roughly $13 billion per month, have been effectively cut off. Storage capacity is approaching its limits. Domestic economic strain, already evident in previous unrest, is likely to intensify significantly. Which brings us to the central question: how does this situation resolve? At present, three broad outcomes appear plausible.